the issues. But frankly, I think, as I say here, the government didn't give enough attention, the opposition didn't give it enough attention, and I think that's a matter for regret.
When you refer a little bit higher up in this paragraph to the CMS Select Committee examining other media-related issues in 2003, without going into any of the detail, is that intended to be a reference to evidence Rebecca Wade, as she then was, gave to the committee on that occasion?
No, I think it's just a general reference to things that weren't right. I mean, when I was writing the evidence, I was trying to reflect on how I felt as I wasn't leader of the opposition then, but just generally. And I looked back at some of the evidence that had come out and thought, well, Parliament was doing its job in that the Select Committee was doing its job, but the party leaderships weren't picking up these issues in perhaps the way they should have done.
Now, before the House of Commons Liaison Committee, when you appeared there in September last year, you put the point explicitly that, and I paraphrase, an overly close relationship permitted regulation issues to be put on the back burner. Yeah. So you're attributing cause and effect. Is that something that you're comfortable with?
Yes, I think that's right. The way I've put it is that politicians were spending their time trying to get their message across, and when it was necessary to disengage from that and discuss regulatory issues, that wasn't happening. And I think that's been happening under governments of both parties for some time.
Okay. What was your reaction to Mr. Blair's feral beast speech of June 2007, aside from the fact that it was a few days before he was departing?
I can't. I mean, I read it again actually in the last couple of days, preparing for this, and there's a lot of good points in it. But the trouble is, there isn't much of a solution. There's quite a good analysis of this problem of the 24-hour news cycle, the turning up of the volume on news and comment, but there wasn't really a specific solution. I can't remember what I said at the time. I've got a horrible feeling that, like all these attempts to try and raise the issue, I suspect the political parties probably didn't really give it much of a backing.
Okay, paragraph 25, Mr. Cameron, you identify a second risk that can lead to the public perception that media proprietors and senior media figures in general, or specific individuals in particular, can have too loud a voice in the country's politics. But isn't it more than just a perception, though, that particular aspect you've identified there?
Well, I think that depends on how robust politicians are in standing up and defending their values, their policies, their approach. I mean, I think we deal with this risk by making transparent all these meetings so people can see who you're seeing. But I would argue very strongly that, my policies are determined by my beliefs, values, my party's beliefs and values, not by what a particular editor or proprietor might want. And I give you some examples in my evidence of where I've had, quite strong disagreements with whether it's Rupert Murdoch over the BBC or the Daily Telegraph over planning or what have you. So of course, this is a risk. You, I think, mitigate it through transparency. But as I also go on to say, you need a vigorous public debate, so people can see if politicians are regularly caving into media pressure that goes against something they previously said, well, the public can draw their own conclusions.
Looking at it more broadly, Camoron put it in this way: the part of the problem may be that politicians have been guilty of a form of appeasement. They've permitted the power of the press to consolidate and be exercised unhindered, and that's happened really over a generation.
I don't like the word appeasement. I think that's a bit too strong. I think what's happened, as I said, is politicians have been focused on getting their message across rather than regulation. I think there have been some good examples of politicians on all sides actually confronting and facing down very strong campaigns that newspapers or others might have. So I don't think politicians have always been guilty of appeasing in that sense. I mean, I use the example of identity cards or 42-day detention, which I was vigorously opposed to, which some parts of the press wanted. But I think it's more than appeasement. It's more about just not focusing on these regulatory issues when they needed to be focused on.
Okay. Now, related to that, is not the size of the voice in part a manifestation of economic and commercial power? In other words, we've allowed too much to accumulate in the hands of a small number of individuals.
I think this is a difficult question. I think sometimes, a lot of the time, it isn't necessarily the size of the newspaper group, it's the strength of voice of the paper. I mean, actually, the Daily Mail is an incredibly sort of powerful voice in the nation's politics because it's a very strong product. It puts its voice very powerfully. And that's not related really to its market power. It's to the way it pushes its agenda. So I don't think it's always about market power, no.
But do you feel, nonetheless, although it might not always be about market power is not the sole explanation. It is part of the explanation, part of the problem.
I think you need... I'm not sure about that. I think, as I say, I think you can have individual papers that are particularly strident, if I can put it that way. Whereas if you look at, the News International group, not always have all the papers headed in the same direction, and some of them, as it were, shout a bit louder than others. So I think it's about the nature of the voice necessarily. But having said that, you do need effective competition policy, effective rules on plurality, and perhaps we'll come on to that.
Thank you. Paragraph 29 now, Mr. Cameron. This is page 04105, the third risk. We've touched on aspects of this already, allowing media pressure to shift and therefore shape the political agenda, and a number of issues here. As you know, a number of witnesses have identified the heart of the problem as the fusion of news and comment. Do you agree with that analysis?
I don't really, because I think it's quite difficult. I mean, look, in an ideal world, it would be lovely if, the front page of the newspaper was all the things that happened in the world yesterday and the comment was entirely separate and all the rest of it. But I think it's quite impractical. I've been thinking about this because a lot of your witnesses have made this point. And I think it's quite difficult to try and separate. So often a headline encapsulates both a fact but also an opinion. And I think it's very clear in the press code that you're not meant to mix news and comment, but it happens. And I think it's rather a forlorn hope to think you can somehow separate them.
To some extent, it plays into the point you were making earlier, that whereas 50 years ago, when there was little television and therefore people got their news very much from their daily newspaper, and they would read the parliamentary debate or they would read of a court case, that was how they learnt the facts.
Yes.
It really plays into your point that because of the 24/7 news cycle, newspapers are now required much more to provide their own angle,
opinion,
I think was one
impact,
of your word, and that means inevitably opinion.
I think that's correct, and that's why I'm sure other politicians would take this view, that of course we spend a lot of time interacting with newspapers and arguing with newspapers and trying to get our point across. But I think if you talk to any modern political party in Britain and you really ask them, what do you really spend your time on more than anything, it's actually the 6 o'clock news, the 10 o'clock news, the thing that's still watched. Okay, not by 15 million people, but I don't know, 6 million people all at once. That's where, it's differently regulated, so it's not such a problem. But I think in terms of how much time do we spend with all these newspaper groups and the rest of it, a big focus, particularly since I've been leading the Conservative Party, has been on television, and I hope that comes across in what I say.
It does mean that the argument about not being held to account doesn't really work when you are being held to account by broadcasting journalists all the time, without it being obvious that the way that they are regulated has impacted the way that they treat you.
Well, I think newspapers and television hold politicians to account in a different way because of the way news is put together. the newspapers do play a very important role in terms of accountability, because they've got, you know, investigative approaches and budgets and the rest of it. They can really go after stories, get to the details. I think there is a difference, and, you know, the strength of our democracy would be a lot weaker if we didn't have both, you know, giving us rightly a tough time.
Yes, I wasn't for a moment suggesting that wasn't right,
Yeah.
but it's not immediately apparent that broadcasters don't hold politicians to account. It seems that they do, and certainly the broadcasters from whom I've heard don't recognise the suggestion that they fail in their duty to ask appropriate questions or probe appropriately, and notwithstanding the strictures of the Ofcom regulatory regime.
I'm sure that's right, but perhaps there are some things that newspapers have been able to do because they don't have the impartiality guidelines. Of course. Things like the Stephen Lawrence campaign or other campaigns, which are more, for want of a better word, edgy. If you didn't have that, yeah.
I entirely agree.
And just understand, Mr. Cameron, is your analysis that on the fusion of news and comment point, either there isn't a problem, so there's no need for a solution, or there is a problem, but there isn't a solution?
There can be a problem in some cases, but, you know, we have to. I don't think it's solvable, so I think we should not try and find some of the answers people have come up with. I don't think are particularly credible.
The issue may be one of culture. Would you agree?
Yes, I mean, I think with all these things, culture is fantastically important. We can write all the rules that we like and have all the training packages, whether it's for ministers or journalist behaviour. Culture is massively important, and I think it's important in every aspect of life.
Thank you. Can we move forward to a point you make in paragraph 131, which links in with this, page 04138. Dealing with the issue of campaigns, which you covered, you say in the last sentence that you've never traded or offered a position on policy in return for the support of any media outlet. I mean, do you believe that others have?
I can't think of any particular examples.
Okay. Now, the fourth risk you identify is about lobbying, but we'll come back to that later on, if we may. And move back, please, to paragraph 47 of your statement. We've covered in part. This is the recent history showing the relationship that came to close. Just want to try and identify since when approximately you believe that phenomenon started to arise.
This is difficult. I would argue it's partly this growth of the 24-hour news agenda, and therefore the different role of newspapers. I think that's had an impact because politicians have wanted to try and get their message across with newspapers taking, as I put, a sort of more aggressive stance. I think there's also some sort of history which you've heard a lot of in the witness of, you know, the John Major government. When I was a special advisor, I mean, it did have an absolutely wretched press and had a terrible time. And I think Labour, quite understandably, thought, well, if we get in, we've got to be better organised, we've got to be more efficient at communicating. And I think, like all things in life, I think the pendulum swung too far the other way, and there was too much spinning and culture of daily news fighting and all the rest of it. And we need the pendulum to swing back a bit while still being professional and able communicators, because you've got to try and get your message across in a difficult world. So I'm not trying to blame the whole thing on New Labour. I think that would be wrong. But I think it's been a developing story. You've got the Conservative government under John Major that knew there was a problem, had this Calcut process, which came to nothing. The last chance saloon, as it were, sort of sat forever. Then you had the arrival of New Labour, and I think the combination of that with the 24-hour news agenda is what lies behind some of the problems.
So the pendulum was swinging in the wrong direction, as it were, possibly from 1994, 1995, and was possibly in the wrong place until certainly July 2011. Does that sound about right?
Well, I think there have been various attempts along the way to grab hold of the pendulum and do something about it. You mentioned the feral beast speech. I mean, that did mention a whole set of things that the last government did in terms of putting briefings on the record, prime ministers going in front of the liaison committee in the House of Commons. I would argue that the new rules for special advisors, we've introduced the greater transparency. So I think there's been steps, but clearly, you know, why are we all here? We're here because of the truly dreadful things that happened, not to politicians, but to ordinary members of the public whose lives have been turned upside down when they've already suffered through losing their children, and then have their lives turned upside down in a totally unacceptable way. And, you know, this is a sort of, I think, a cathartic moment where press, politicians, police, all the relationships that haven't been right, we have a chance to reset them, and that is what we must do.
What do you see as the harm to the public interest? How would you define it, flowing from this relationship of undue proximity?
Well, the way I put it is that the closeness, which I've talked about, leads, I think, potentially to these risks. And I've enumerated the risks, and clearly those risks have the potential to do the public harm unless they're properly dealt with. Now, I think this is doable and achievable, and it needs to be done.
Is it possible to describe one of the risks in this way, that the relationship has become transactional, that although there may not be express deals, there are implied understandings or concordats, because each party well knows what the other wants?
I don't accept that. I mean, first of all, on this idea of overt deals, this idea that somehow the Conservative Party and News International got together and said, you know, you give us your support and we'll wave through this merger that, by the way, we didn't even know about at that stage. I think the idea of overt deals is nonsense, and you've heard that from lots of people in front of this inquiry. I also don't believe in this theory that there was sort of nod and a wink and some sort of covert agreement. You know, of course, I wanted to win over newspapers and other journalists, editors, proprietors, broadcasters. I worked very hard at that because I wanted to communicate what the Conservative Party and my leadership could bring to the country. I made those arguments, but I didn't do it on the basis of saying, you know, or either overtly or covertly, you know, your support will mean that I'll give you a better time on this policy or that policy. And there are plenty of examples of policies which I believe in that the people who are backing me didn't believe in.
Is there also a risk that overly close personal relationships, by which I mean individual relationships between politicians and journalists, have allowed judgments to be clouded?
I think obviously you have to take care when you have personal friendships, but I think that can be done. And I like to think that I've done that.
Okay. I'm still on the general perspectives, Mr. Cameron. Can I ask you to comment, please, on the allied vices, if I can describe them as such, of manipulation of the media by politicians, favouritism and anonymous briefings. Have you seen evidence of these vices in your own party?
Yes, I mean, you know, these things do happen, and it's, you know, deeply regrettable. And you know, I think as long as there's been a press and politicians, these things happen. But you know, it is very regrettable. It often makes, you know, running a political party more difficult, running a government more difficult. You know, it's deeply destructive. But I think there are degrees of this, of course. You know, some politicians have journalists they have a particularly good relationship with. They think they're going to understand a particular speech or a particular idea better than others. And in this world where the newspapers aren't reporting yesterday's news, because that's already been reported, clearly, newspapers are looking for something special. They're looking for a particular angle or a particular story. So there are responsible ways of handling media relations in that way, but you know, briefing against people, doing people down. There are some dreadful things that have been done in politics on both sides in recent years, and they're very, very regrettable.
What's the solution to these vices, in your view?
Well, I don't think there's any one catch-all. I think there has been a problem in terms of some individuals and some special advisors, and I think we now have a better special advisors code. One of the things I wrote into the code is that special advisors work for the whole government, not just individual ministers. I think that's important. But I don't think there's any one, as you say, it's a mixture of rules and culture.
Well, Sir John Major made the point in relation to proprietors that they're responsible for the culture in their organisation, and it was within their power, gift, as it were, to put a halt to bad practice and to a poor culture. Does the same argument, in your view, apply to politicians, that it's perhaps the responsibility of those at the top?
Yes, I think it is, and if I think it's very important if you find out that these things have been happening, you need to condemn them properly and act properly. I think that is the case.
I'll ask you to address Mr. Brown's point that reporting is hyperbolic, it's sensationalised. He said that politicians don't simply make errors of judgment, their motives are always put into question. Do you associate yourself, as a matter of generality, with that point or not?
I think there are occasions when that can happen. As I've said, it links back to this thing about newspapers being under pressure to find something special and different and go for impact. And sometimes that can mean questioning motives. So you do, I don't want to make this sound like sort of politicians complaining about, of course we should have a vigorous press and they should give us a good going over, and they do, and that's fine. Sometimes it is frustrating when you feel your motives are endlessly being questioned. But there's bound to be a certain amount of that. But I think the way I put it is that the volume knob has sometimes just been turned really high in our press, and I'm not sure sometimes that does anyone any favours.
Well, the volume knob is turned too high, and a consequence of that is motive is always impugned, rather than if you turn it down lower and examine human nature as it is, it's usually the result of an error of judgment if mistakes are made, and not some venal or appalling motive. Is that the way you see the world?
I mean, there have been politicians with bad motives, and if a politician is discovered doing something for a bad motive, the press shouldn't hold off making that point. So, that I think is all fair for the press to challenge that. But it's just sometimes it feels as if the volume knob is being turned up unnecessarily.
Thank you. May I move on now to the second area of your evidence, Mr. Cameron? This is your own personal approach, and we can start, I think, with paragraph 73 of your witness statement, which is our page 04118. You explain the nature and frequency of your contact. Such contact may include formal on-the-record interviews, informal background discussions, coincidental dialogue. So that pattern is, of course, the same as everyone else's. Paragraph 74, no formal record of who initiated the contact, although you believe in the majority of cases contact would be initiated by your staff. Is that right? Yes.
I mean, we had, in becoming leader of the Conservative Party at the end of 2005, clearly had a programme of wanting to get our message and policies and approach across, and that meant a proactive campaign of talking to journalists, and whether it was regional newspapers, national newspapers, television stations, and I hope in the exhibit DC2. I mean, there's a fantastic set of, it goes on for 5 years of meetings. I can't promise it's 100% accurate because you're going back to paper-based diaries and 2005 and the rest of it, but it's a pretty big list.
Do you have a strategy at the beginning of each year where you map out who you should be seeing over the course of the year, or is it much more adventitious? In other words, your staff decides on a weekly or monthly basis who you might see. In other words, there isn't a strategy that if News International is 36% of the market, it follows that you should be seeing them 36% of the time, if I can put it in that way.
The strategy mapped out at the beginning of the year are the things you want to achieve, the policies you want to get across, the ideas that you want to champion. And then after that, you think, right, how do we do that? What's the mixture of newspapers and television and direct campaigns and the rest we want to do? Then following that, I think you're looking at, well, where are we going to have impact? I mean, I like to think from the information I've given, you can see that I've spent a huge amount of time with all newspapers, but you are thinking, with all respect to the Daily Mirror, there's only a certain amount of impact I'm going to have from meeting with the Daily Mirror, whereas as it were, newspapers who have in the past or might in the future back a conservative cause are obviously going to be better grounds for me.
So the main touchstone then is impact. And as you rightly say, you're not going to devote too much time to those who may not be supporting you. Let's focus on those who are either on side or might be on side. That's the basic point.
Yes, but I just repeat again that that the television cannot be on your side because there are rules of impartiality. But, a huge amount of time when I became leader of the party was spent thinking, right, how do we get our message across on the television? Because I think, as I've said, I think that is the most important medium of communication.
There's no formal record, you say in paragraph 77, of what was discussed in each meeting, and we can quite see that if there were a lengthy list, that would be oppressive, bureaucratic and counterproductive. Yeah. But what about just encapsulating the gist in 2 or 3 sentences of what was discussed to add greater transparency? Would you favour that or not?
I think there are improvements we can make here. I think the idea that someone suggested of a sort of written note of every interaction with every editor, every broadcast, I think that would be overly bureaucratic, because most of the meetings are pretty similar. You're explaining why you're in favour of free schools and academies and how to get that message across and why the policy is a good idea. You're explaining something that you've already published. But where I think there is potential for improvement is in 2 areas. If it's obvious that this is a meeting where the proprietor or the broadcasting business or what have you has got some commercial issues they want to raise, then I think it does make sense that a note is taken. Or if in a meeting that's really about your policies and your approach and the rest of it, there's a discussion about commercial interest, then I think again in government, it's under the ministerial code. I think it's probably right that the minister or the politician should should make a reference to that to the private secretary. I mean, a good example of this I give, and I don't want to, give a kick to an industry that's having a difficult time anyway. Regional newspapers, I go all over the country, as other politicians do. You have lots of meetings with regional newspaper groups, and you're there explaining why the government's helping the East Midlands or the West Country or whatever it is. But often they will say, quite fairly, we are being hammered by these free newspapers that are being put out by local authorities. They're taking advertising. It's not fair. This is the big state, as it were, squashing out the big society. What are you going to do about it? Now, I think it's completely fair for them to raise that point. But you could argue that is a media organisation raising a policy point rather than just having an exchange about politics and policies. And so in some way that needs to be registered. The problem with all this is the more rules and codes we create, the more difficult it is to make sure in every instance that people abide by them. And I don't want to create a system that doesn't work, that is permanently broken, that would actually sap the faith of the public in this whole area. But I think some modest additions to the ministerial code to deal with the 2 particular points I've made, I think that is something we could certainly look at.
In paragraph 79, Mr. Cameron, you identify a small number of journalists who are close friends of yours, not included in your list, and you name them there. It's inevitable, of course, that friendships would arise, and these are friendships which have developed over the years. Is that right?
That's right, and the reason for putting this in is that it goes to the last point I made. The more we write these rules, the more danger there is that you're going to forget that you bumped into so-and-so or had a meeting with such and such, and then it comes out that you didn't reveal that, and then the public loses all the confidence they had in your new transparency regime. So that's the purpose, I think, of these are people I see very regularly, and I'm never going to remember to tell my office every time I see them.
And you say that sometimes informal assistance is provided with speeches. I suppose the main risk here, and I ask you to comment on it, is that you provide these journalists with scoops or stories, or put less tendentiously, with insights which they can then deploy. Is that fair?
Well, there's obviously a danger, but you can't unmake the friendships that you have, and some of these people I've known for 20, 30 years. Some of them you get to know because, in some cases, they're neighbours, Zan Smiley. I think one of the things that all ministers are meant to do, he was doing its job, but the party leaderships weren't picking up these issues in perhaps the way they should have done.
Now, before the House of Commons Liaison Committee, when you appeared there in September last year, you put the point explicitly that, and I paraphrase, an overly close relationship permitted regulation issues to be put on the back burner. Yeah. So you're attributing cause and effect. Is that something that you're comfortable with?
Yes, I think that's right. The way I've put it is that politicians were spending their time trying to get their message across, and when it was necessary to disengage from that and discuss regulatory issues, that wasn't happening. And I think that's been happening under governments of both parties for some time.
Okay. What was your reaction to Mr. Blair's feral beast speech of June 2007, aside from the fact that it was a few days before he was departing?
I can't. I mean, I read it again actually in the last couple of days, preparing for this, and there's a lot of good points in it. But the trouble is there isn't much of a solution. There's quite a good analysis of this problem of the 24-hour news cycle, the turning up of the volume on news and comment, but there wasn't really a specific solution. I can't remember what I said at the time. I've got a horrible feeling that, like all these attempts to try and raise the issue, I suspect the political parties probably didn't really give it much of a backing.
Okay, paragraph 25, Mr. Cameron, you identify a second risk that can lead to the public perception that media proprietors and senior media figures...
But as I also go on to say, you need a vigorous public debate so people can see if politicians are regularly caving into media pressure that goes against something they previously said, well, the public can draw their own conclusions.
Looking at it more broadly, Camoron put it in this way: the part of the problem may be that politicians have been guilty of a form of appeasement. They've permitted the power of the press to consolidate and be exercised unhindered, and that's happened really over a generation.
I don't like the word appeasement. I think that's a bit too strong. I think what's happened, as I said, is politicians have been focused on getting their message across rather than regulation. I think there have been some good examples of politicians on all sides actually confronting and facing down very strong campaigns that newspapers the issues. But frankly, I think, as I say here, the government didn't give enough attention, the opposition didn't give it enough attention, and I think that's a matter for regret.
When you refer a little bit higher up in this paragraph to the CMS Select Committee examining other media-related issues in 2003, without going into any of the detail, is that intended to be a reference to evidence Rebecca Wade, as she then was, gave to the committee on that occasion?
No, I think it's just a general reference to things that weren't right. I mean, when I was writing the evidence, I was trying to reflect on how I felt as I wasn't leader of the opposition then, but just generally. And I looked back at some of the evidence that had come out and thought, well, Parliament was doing its job in that the Select Committee...
In general, or specific individuals in particular, can have too loud a voice in the country's politics. But isn't it more than just a perception, though, that particular aspect you've identified there?
Well, I think that depends on how robust politicians are in standing up and defending their values, their policies, their approach. I mean, I think we deal with this risk by making transparent all these meetings so people can see who you're seeing. But I would argue very strongly that, you know, my policies are determined by my beliefs, values, my party's beliefs and values, not by what a particular editor or proprietor might want. And I give you some examples in my evidence of where I've had, you know, quite strong disagreements with whether it's Rupert Murdoch over the BBC or the Daily Telegraph over planning or what have you. So of course, this is a risk. You, I think, mitigate it through transparency.